We are at the forefront of many innovative and exciting things developing in the world of senior living. With Tim Mallad, CEO of Forefront Living, as our guide, this show will shine a light on how older adults can embrace these changes to live active, happy, fulfilling, and thriving lives. Through discussions with senior living and hospice professionals, architects and designers, and people of all ages, will help today's seniors envision the art of the possible and take steps toward achieving the future of their dreams. Welcome to At the Forefront.
Welcome to At the Forefront. I'm Tim Mallad, CEO of Forefront Living, and we're excited to be here today, and we have author Michael Clinton with us. We're going to talk today about Michael's new book called Roar. A little bit of background information on Michael, a world traveler, 120 plus countries, 40 plus years in the publishing industry, former president of Hearst Publications. But Michael, that's only part of the story. Welcome, and maybe I left that teaser out there. Can you tell us a little bit more about the story and how it relates to your new book?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim. It's great to be with you and letting me tell a little bit of the story. As you mentioned, 40 years in the publishing world, with lots of experiences during that in, launching Oprah's magazine and Food Network and HGTV and buying companies and having a great experience. In my early days, I was the publisher of GQ. So a lot of great stories. I live in New York City, and so I'm still there and also in Santa Fe, New Mexico, back and forth a bit. So yeah, that's part of the professional story. I think what is the story I love to tell, because people think I have this big fancy New York life, and it is true, but I got there in a very interesting and circuitous way. I came from a poor working class family in Pittsburgh where there was sort of no money and no education, and got inspired as literally the editor of my high school newspaper and the publisher of my university newspaper, and said, I think I want to go pursue this publishing thing. So I went to New York with $60 in my pocket and no contacts and a couch to sleep on for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I stretched it. And I found my way. And so I think it's a great message to younger people who might be tuning in that you can do it at any time in your life if you really have the focus and the desire to get somewhere.
So how does it get much better than that? You worked your way up. You had the classic American success story. Yeah. You achieved a position, having a journalism degree myself, that all of us aspire to. Can it get any better than that?
Yeah, no, I actually started out as a journalist and a reporter, and then I moved over to the publishing side, which was running the business of the magazines, and ultimately as the president and publishing director of Hearst. But yeah, no, it was, I like to say there was some skill, but there was a lot of luck and some timing, and it's like a big stew. A lot of different ingredients went into it. But I was very fortunate that I got to the top of my industry and had a spectacular career. But those 40 years, I realized, are really just the beginning of what is going to be next chapters. And I think that's what the book Roar is all about, is next chapters in reinvention and reimagining, regardless of where you are on your life journey.
Well, most of us have the concept of retirement embedded in us. After 40 years, you get the gold watch and there's blue sky, sunshine, golf ahead of us. That wasn't for you though, was it?
Retirement is, to me, a caustic word because it has a lot of, conjures up a lot of sort of downward spiral possibilities. So we flipped the words to refire or rewire. Because if you're 60 and you're healthy, you're going to probably live to be 90. So, if you quote retire, you can go play golf for a year or two, but it's hard to sustain that for 30 years. So the message of this book and the 40 people I interviewed and the tips and the tactics in the book is really about how can you rewire at 50 or 60 or 70 or at midpoint, in midpoint. Midpoint to me for this book is 50-ish because you're going to, as I said, live to be 90 or 100. So, lots more living that you can do above and beyond what was the traditional construct.
How do you rewire?
Well, I think part of it is, this notion of hitting midlife. I talk about midlife awakening, Because if you've lived 25 years as an adult, you know a lot about yourself, right? I mean, you know what you're good at, you know what you're bad at, you know that you've made good decisions, you know your stupid decisions, you know a lot about yourself. So how do you tap into the good stuff? How do you say to yourself, I'm really good at this, and I didn't really know that until I was 45 or 50 or older. And how do I tap into that and awaken my own sensibility to moving in a new kind of direction? So it takes some imagination, some creativity, some reimagining, but it's very doable. It's very doable.
In your book, you talk about a number of people, some very famous people that really rewired. I think if I remember correctly, you had Ray Kroc, McDonald's. Right. You had Colonel Sanders, Kentucky Fried Chicken, but then you have a host of other individuals who took the chance to rewire. Does any one of those stories of someone like us resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the stories I love to tell is a woman who was in her 50s who studied English, was a journalist and an editor, and in her 50s decided she wanted to become a medical doctor, which is not an easy path, Tim. I mean, this is complicated for a 25-year-old, let alone a 55-year-old. But she did the work and figured out how she had to do it. And she went back to school and got her biology and chemistry. And then she took the MCATs, and she couldn't get into an American medical school because of ageism, I would argue. So she went to the Caribbean. And in her early 60s, she became a doctor, a medical doctor. And it was a great example of someone who really pushed self-imposed ageism out of the way, cultural ageism out of the way, and really said, I can do this. This is something that I'm driven to do, and I can, have the desire to do this. And she did it. So she's one of many stories. The people I talked to, I wanted to talk to people who did the rewire, who did a 180 rewire, not I left my profession and became a consultant for my profession. I really wanted to tell stories of people who did a complete change, and she was one of them.
In your book, you talk about an individual who was, shall we say, very close to you, that really was in a very traditional role of wife and mother, and at around the age that you talked about, decided to change some things and have a very full life all the way through 88. And she had a very unique beginning, so I hope I'm not stealing the thunder, but can you tell me a little bit about this woman?
Well, I'll tell you this woman, she started out in her young life by joining a convent and becoming a nun. And her parents pulled her out of the convent because they didn't want her to be there. It's a long story. She ran away and joined the Air Force, because you go to the Air Force, they can't pull you out, right? So she figured, I'll do that for a couple of years, go back to the convent. Lo and behold, she met a guy, which is oftentimes the story. They had 6 children, but she was a homemaker. She had a high school degree. And in her late 40s, as all of her kids were leaving the nest, she decided she needed to go to work. So she took a walk to the local travel agency and said, I'll work for free for 6 months, and if I'm good, will you hire me? Cut the deal. They ended up hiring her. She became a travel agent for 25 years, went backpacking in her late 50s on her own in Europe. At 64, decided to leave her husband because she just wanted a different kind of life. She wanted to follow her own dreams at that point. All 6 kids were grown up. And she lived 25 years sort of on her terms and her life. And as you know, she was very close to me because she was my mother. So Mom was an inspiration for courage and reinvention and reimagining what she wanted for her life. So yeah.
And how did that impact you?
I think I was always inspired by her because she had the guts to do things that were sort of counter to the way the script was written. And I think that I probably have some of that in me as a result of just being her son, and other family members do too. But it took me not until my adult life, and I really reflected on it, to really appreciate. I mean, she was an everyday woman who made extraordinary decisions about her everyday life. And so there's a lesson there for all of us, that if you have the vision and the commitment to something you want to do, she was a North Star on that front.
Well, you talk about age, and in the book, and in some of the discussions we've had, you mentioned 50 in the 50s as a sweet spot, but in the book you talk even 65, 75,
Right.
85.
Right.
Can you share
Yeah.
some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to go back to the self-imposed ageism, because people say, well, I'm 55 and I can't do that, excuse me, or I'm 65 and I can't do that. And many people in the book, some of them started second careers in their 60s and 70s, but they approached it in a different way. They didn't approach it like their first career, to say this is going to be a building block and I'm going to get promoted and I'm going to move up through the pipeline, so to speak, and get, they really approached it as a labor of love, that this is something that they've really wanted to do. And it might be a 10-year run, it might be a 5-year run, it might be a 20-year run, but they unlocked themselves from their own barriers to be able to step into that kind of new beginning. And one of the people I talk about in the book is an 85-year-old, Alan Patrikoff, who started a venture fund at 85 to fund businesses. It's called Primetime Partners, and they fund businesses for goods and services and products that will help an aging population. And they have 20 investments now. And they spend a lot of their time with what I'll call older entrepreneurs who have experience and knowledge and wisdom and resources. And it's a great example. I mean, he started a business at 85. You know the name Charlie Gibson, who was on Good Morning America. He just started a business with his daughter, a podcasting business about books. So he started that business at 85. I have a friend who's 94, Pat Schoenfeld, who just produced her first documentary called On Broadway. And if you know the New York Broadway scene, Schoenfeld is a big name, and it was her husband, who is long gone, but he was really the guy who revitalized Broadway back in the 1970s, he and others. But Pat became a documentarian in her 90s, and she went out and raised the money, and she worked on the product, and it was a whole new approach. So I think you can do it at any age. You just have to find how you want to spend your time and how you're going to do it.
In your presentation, you talked a good deal about demographics and
Right.
about, for lack of a better term, the age wave. And for those of us 50 and above, 60 and above, 70 and so on, what role can we play in these changing demographics, especially as it relates to the workforce?
Well, for starters, since we're all going to be living a lot longer, we're all going to probably be working a lot longer. We may choose to work, we may have to work. Every day, 10,000 people turn 65 in this country. In 2030, 1 in 5 people will be 65 or older, which is a big number. And by 2060, there will be 90 million people in this country are over 65. Now, think about that. Think about how this huge bulge in the population is going to push and change everything. I call it a major social movement that is just upon us. It's going to mean different workforce policies, different kinds of jobs, government policies. It's going to be new careers. It's going to have a huge impact on this movement. And by the way, it's global. It's not just in the US. And with birth rates being so low, I mean, we already know that the youngest generations are significantly smaller than certainly the millennials and Gen X and the boomers. So it's going to really, as the proverbial pig goes through the python, and you see this bulge go through, it's the people who are going to demand the change, wanting to work longer, not wanting to be traditionally retired, and companies are going to have to accommodate that. Might be different kinds of jobs, but people will work, much longer into their 70s because of the new longevity.
When I first saw the book and I saw the title and I understood some of the concepts, I was assuming that roar meant that you were going into this phase of your life with a roar and with energy, and I think some of that's very true.
Right.
But roar has another meaning to it, or another philosophy to it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the word roar obviously is a big action word, so you want to be dynamic into the second half of your life, but it's really an acronym So if you're interested, I can walk you through
I'm very
the
interested.
acronym and your
Absolutely.
viewers. The first R is really about the reimagination process and how we rethink how we want to create our future for ourselves. And the inspirational stories are there, but the tools and tips are there. And a part of this is taking on self-imposed ageism that we talked about. A part of this is understanding what is your favorite future, how do you be true to yourself in terms of your future. So part one is kind of how you go and set up the foundation. The O is owning your numbers. Own your health numbers, own your wealth numbers, because if you're going to live a long life, how are you going to sustain your lifestyle, right? On those two fronts. Own your age. I like to say 60 is the new 60. 60 is not the new 40. Let's embrace it, because we all have to be the role models for what 60 or 70 or 80 is going to look like. And of course, there's a final number that we all have, which is the day when we leave the earth. And we have to live with death every day alongside of us and really embrace the idea that there will be an end date. And so what do we want to do? One of the great little fun games in the book is, if you're 60, go to 90, write your story from 90 to 60. What do you want to accomplish? What is your goal to accomplish in the next 30 years on all fronts? And so that's an important process to go through. And we have some great, as I said, some great little quizzes and tips to get there. The A is the action plan. Two things that I focus on are something called life layering and lifelong learning, which are important to growth and expansion in your second year. Life layering is take away your role as spouse, parent, employee, and put them over here and build out the personas for you and what it is that you want to become and who you want to become. So that those definitions are all great, but what are you going to do as an individual for yourself to really build out the action plan? And the life layering concept is how you build those experiences and those personas. So I've practiced that for almost 30 years and have multiple layers to my big, huge, delicious cake that are on top of my other definitions to be able to have my own self-satisfaction and fulfillment.
So let's talk about you for a minute. Very much, you had the Holy Grail. You had, and from at least this side of the chair here, you had the perfect career. How were you able to begin the process while you're in the midst of this career? You're at the pinnacle. Many of us understand that, at 50, your top earning years, and, that's really the time you make an impact, and you start layering. How did you approach that in the midst of all of that?
Yeah, it's about priority of time. It's about discipline. It's about commitment. It's about the final R, which is all about relationships and getting your support system around you. It's also identifying what it is that you want. So when I built my adventure layer, which I call it, so I'm 68. 68 is the new 68, right? I started that at 40. So I've been doing that for 28 years. So lots of being a private pilot, flying, running marathons on all 7 continents, including Antarctica, hiking mountains all over the world, going to Madagascar, looking for the lemurs, on and on and on. But it was a devotion and a commitment to that layer. And what happens is the cumulative effect of that has lasting value. And it stays with you. And if you find what is passionate for you and you build on it, you find the time to build it into your life. As a marathon runner, and I'm sure there are some people who are watching this who are marathon runners, the discipline of marathon training is a good foundation, because you have to go out and do the miles. You have to go out and do the work. And what I found with the 40 people who I interviewed, they all went out and did the work for whatever it is that they wanted to do. And I think that's a commitment from self.
Well, you just don't wake up and run a marathon. And I think in the book, you talk a little bit about you have to plan a bit and you have to commit to certain things. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, what I do is I keep what I call a life journal. So I do it in the beginning of the year. I kind of map out the year in terms of what do I want to accomplish, and I check in on it once a month. First Saturday of the month. Make a big fat latte, go out to the garden, sit in the pergola, open up the Life Journal. How am I doing? If it's May and I said my goal this year was to learn Spanish, and May is there and I haven't learned Spanish, then I can only be accountable to myself, right? So it's being brutally honest and brutally, we have a really important word in my business. It's called editing, right? So you have to edit out the extraneous to get to the things that you want to do and accomplish. So it's really a report card, and only you can help hold yourself accountable to it. So that process I've used for a long time, and we talk a lot about it in the book and how you can go about doing it to create this kind of focus and discipline for yourself.
I think what's interesting is there would be a perception, and we've talked a lot about numbers, so we've talked about owning your numbers, that you have to achieve a certain amount of wealth or success before you can do this. But that's not necessarily so, is it?
Good question. No, there are lots of ways. One of the big questions I hear is people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who say, I'd love to go back to school and learn something new, but I don't have the time and I don't have the money. Well, time becomes how you treat it, and maybe you don't binge watch Stranger Things for 8 episodes, and maybe you do something else. Guilty to binging Stranger Things, by the way. It's amazing, but so you have to figure that out. But there's a lot of money around, especially for 50+ people on the school front and learning. And there are a lot of states where you can go to universities for free if you're over a certain age. If your income is low, you can go to school for free. In the state of Tennessee, you can go to community college or trade school for free through something called the Tennessee Promise. So there are lots of ways. The woman I talked about earlier, who was the doctor and became the doctor, she got her entire medical education paid for by doing the homework and finding the scholarships. She used something called Scholarship OWL, OWL. And so there's a way to get reskilled, upskilled, newly skilled, and take that out. I just met a woman who's in her 60s who just took a data analytics course. And there's a huge demand for data analysts. And she got I think it was a 6-month course, and she got a job as a data analyst, completely different than the previous job she had had. So it can be done at every level. It doesn't have to be done at the highest level of education. During COVID, a woman I interviewed was a restaurant worker, and she went online and became a pharmacy technician, and took a course for free and became a pharm tech, and left the restaurant business, which had been hurt during COVID, and moved into the pharm tech space. And so she wasn't a college graduate, but she found this skill, and she's working in that space now. So ingenuity.
You have mentioned in this discussion ageism.
Yeah.
And I think there's some perhaps self-imposed ageism. I think something embedded in a lot of our minds are, I'm 56. If this career ends, who would hire me?
Right.
What could I possibly do?
Right.
What opportunities do you think are out there for individuals who are 55 and above going forward?
Well, first of all, it's all going to change because of just the sheer size of this group of people moving through the pipeline, as we talked earlier. There are a lot of first of all, the nonprofit sector is always looking for amazing people who've had amazing experiences, and I think it's one of the areas that is not as ageist as, let's say, traditional corporate America. One of the things in corporate America, PwC did a study, only 8% of American companies include age as part of their DEI policy. And that's going to have to change. It's sort of changing already, but it's going to have to change, and the people are going to force it, because people will want to work longer in their professions or their company. And so I think there'll be a longer runway that's going to happen. But part of where someone can go at 55 or 60, I think of nonprofit certainly as an area. I think of an area where you can go and get an entirely new skill that's emerging, like data analysis that we talked about. I love the story of a man who was written up in the New York Times, who was in his 70s. He had owned a business, and he went back to school to get his college degree, and he became a first-time teacher at 80, and he's teaching a class at 80. So there's always something to be able to do if you really think about, what am I good at? What do I want to do? How do I get there? The ageism phenomena is real, for sure, but I think it's going to change because of this new longevity. I see it changing already.
And one of the concepts I thought was interesting in the book, and you touched a little bit on it already in your own personal history and then in some of the stories, is really owning where we come from, owning who we are.
Yeah.
And you know, your parents had 6 children. Your father was not a doctor. Your mom was stay-at-home, raised children. Talk to us about owning that phase of our life, because oftentimes we construct a story around that, or we avoid those early years. How important is that?
You know, I will admit, in the beginning, it was a struggle for me because I was the first one in my entire family history to go to college. And so I was taking that path without a lot of family support or understanding. My parents were very supportive of it, but they hadn't had the experience. And in all candor, and I talk about this in the book, in my early 20s, I never talked about it because I was trying to find my way in the big New York publishing scene. And so I thought maybe that was a handicap. But as I started to get some success, I realized that what I thought was my handicap was really my strength, because it gave me a perspective about people and about watching people and their work ethics and their goals. And so I think that, fortunately, I think we live in a more egalitarian place right now in the country, even with our divisiveness. We're living in a place where diversity is being discussed and equality is being discussed. And I remember when I first came to New York and to be in the publishing business, I went to one company that shall go unnamed, and if you didn't go to Yale or Harvard, you weren't hired by that company. So I knew that company was not for me. First of all, they weren't going to hire me, but did I really want to put myself in that position? Because I didn't go to Yale or Harvard. I went to a great school, University of Pittsburgh, but I needed to find a place where that wasn't going to be a handicap in my career. And where I ended up landing was actually, ironically, one of the most luxurious publishing companies, which was Condé Nast, which puts out, you know, amazing, luxurious titles for the elite and the upper class. But most of us who worked there were not of that place. So I kind of found my tribe when I went to work there. And that's when I was able to be a lot more comfortable about what my background was.
Today you talked to us about being a baby boomer, really, I think, having the quintessential baby boomer experience and social change, and maybe challenging the establishment may have come up more than once in your discussion. How does that philosophy impact aging and what we can all expect?
So I'm a boomer, as many 71 million of us. The conversation we were having is that the boomers were the original activists. I mean, they were the ones who marched against the Vietnam War and embraced Earth Day and civil rights and women's rights. And if you think about our early days and our early legacy, you know, sex and drugs and rock and roll, I mean, we opened up a lot in the culture, and we were on the cusp of changing things. And we've always changed things as we've moved through our process. So I will predict that the boomers are going to have a major fit about how they're going to age, and they're going to change the aging process. We're seeing it already. You know, they're tech savvy, they're fit, they're travelers, they're curious, they're rejecting a lot of the traditional script. They're redefining what aging looks like. I mean, look at someone like you know, Lenny Kravitz, you know, who is almost 60, and what he looks like, or Sting, you know, or Jane Fonda, who's actually older than a boomer. All of these role models are already beginning to emerge. The Golden Girls, the actresses in the Golden Girls, were in their 50s. Now, think about the women in the Sex and the City series. They're in their 50s. So just look at the comparison in the culture between how 50s was represented then versus how 50s is represented now. And there are a lot of things that are emerging to shine a light on saying, this is what 60 can look like. This is the kind of life you can have at 70. This is the kind of life you can have at 80. And I think we're the pioneers who are leading that charge for ourselves, for our peers. But more importantly, I want the kids in our family who are 40 and 30 to say, wow, I can do that when I'm 60. I can do that when I'm 70. Versus when I think about the 60 and 70-year-olds when I was young, they were the traditional construct. And if you look back, you saw your grandmother who was 70 versus today's 70-year-old. I mean, it's radically different. So we're leading the charge, and we'll change a lot of this.
So what's next on the agenda if you're leading the charge? Any peek behind the curtain for what the plans are going forward?
Well, for me, working my layers, lots of my layers, I'm hoping when I turn 70 in 2 years to hike to the Everest Base Camp and run a marathon down, which is a fundraiser. And I'm hoping to do that for my own satisfaction and being able to show that I can do that physically, but also to be a bit of a role model to say this is what 70 can do for people. And there are lots of other examples. I watched the first 100-year-old man cross the finish line of the Toronto Marathon, and he didn't run his first marathon until he was 82. So go figure. Yeah. So I'm inspired by people who are doing things, in the second half of life that's unexpected. And I want to be one of those people, and I also want to be around those kind of people.
We've talked a lot about how this concept can benefit us individually, but throughout the book there's a thread of philanthropy, there's a thread of giving back.
Right.
And I think as we talk, we'd be remiss not to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I've always been service-minded my whole life. It was taught in my family, volunteering, participating, donating. It was a family value. Even though we had limited funds, we were always helping others. And so I've carried this throughout my life in different forms, in different ways. I was the chairman of the Volunteers of America in New York. I've been on multiple nonprofit boards, Starlight Foundation. I'm on several nonprofit boards now. I've started my own foundation. When I went back to school in my 60s to get a master's degree at Columbia, it was in nonprofit philanthropy. So I was passionate about the topic. It was 12 courses and grueling and papers and tests and all that stuff, but it was totally invigorating. And this lifelong learning piece, it keeps your mind going. And philanthropy is, I think, an important inherent human value that we should all embrace in any way that we can. And the philanthropy world, in America, there's going to be the largest transfer of generational wealth in the history of the world over the next 20 plus years. $60 to $70 trillion worth of assets that the boomers and those above them are sitting on. And hopefully not all of it's going to go to the next generation, because those kids have to find their own way. But it's important to have social impact while we're alive. So I like to say the boomers should go back to their activist roots and take some of that money and create foundations and build social impact against whatever it is that you're interested in and you're passionate about. Our foundation is called Circle of Generosity, and we do random acts of kindness for people who are sort of in an emergency situation in their lives. They need money for rent so they don't get evicted and so forth. And that's a very passionate area for me, having come from a struggling youth background. So find your passion, find your purpose, live it every day, integrate it into your life as a layer. My philanthropy layer continues to get rich and is something that I'm hoping to spend the rest of my life on.
So final question for you is, what inspires you, or what is inspiring you right now?
What's inspiring me right now is looking at people who are, and companies and organizations and entities that see the possibilities in a dynamic and different future. So for people who are 50 plus, I'm drawn to seeing what a 60 and a 70 and 80-year-old can do that is not following the script. I'm drawn to showcasing their stories. I'm back to my own journalism roots. I'm now writing for Esquire, and I'm writing for Men's Health and other places. We have a monthly newsletter that's roarbymichaelclinton.com. You can sign up, that takes on the topic. But I want to shed a light on the people who are rewriting the script. That to me is really the exciting, dynamic future.
Well, hopefully today, and by visiting Forefront Living, you got to meet some of those people.
I did.
And would like to thank you for joining us on At the Forefront. Would like to thank everyone who's watching for joining us, and hopefully you've been inspired as well. And Michael, we hope to visit with you again in the very near future.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you as well. Thank you.